Thank you. It's an honor to be here, and I appreciate the organizers for inviting me. This has been a wonderful event, and thank you for that generous introduction. My Spanish is even more limited than the lovely woman who introduced me, and so I'm just going to stick with English and rely on the translators, and so I appreciate them as well. I teach and do research on business ethics, and I've heard all of the jokes that those two things don't go together, do they? Is this like oil and water? Or my favorite is when I tell people I teach business ethics, they say, wow, it must be a really short course. And so I understand why there's skepticism, but I think that this conference has been excellent at drawing out the importance and helping us understand why a fundamental consideration of values and ethics is so critically important in business and the media and government and public life. So, as I said, my job is to train and work with students and business executives. And so I'm really going to speak to you as if you were my students or the executives that I work with. And I think others on the panel that follow will speak a little bit more about how to teach ethics and the approach that they might take in the classroom. But I'm going to let that be a little bit implicit in my remarks. So let me start by asking you a question. And let's see if it'll help if I can move it forward, right? Let's see. Oh, there we go. All right. So here's, I think, kind of a fundamental question, which is, what do you think of when you think of business ethics? Perhaps you might think of, let's see if this will advance here. We're working the kinks out. There we go. Okay. So you might think of business ethics as involving compliance or rules and regulations and the law. We've had some comments about that today already. And I think that's a way of thinking about business ethics. We might also think of business ethics as having to do with dramatic stories about, good companies or bad companies, heroes and villains. And I think that these are definitely ways of thinking about business ethics. But I also believe that if these are the only ways we think about business ethics, we miss something important. And that's what I want to focus on a little bit today. So let me illustrate this with a story. And it's a story that involves my family. So this is my family. My lovely wife, Jody, accompanied me to the Dominican Republic, and she's sitting in the audience today. And we have 4 sons. The oldest is 18, and the youngest is 12. And about a month ago, we had a big family event, and we gathered all of my family together, including my parents. So in this picture, you can also see my mother and father. Mi mamá y papá. There's a little Spanish. That's about all I can do. And I want to tell you a little story about one of the individuals in this photo, and that is my dad. If I can get the slide to advance, I'm going to try this one more time. There we go. There it is. Okay. So I'm going to talk to you about my dad just for a moment. So my father is 91 years old, and he looks pretty good for 91, and recently traveled out to spend some time with us, as I said, for a family event. My dad worked in business, but he was not a CEO. So you've heard today from some distinguished entrepreneurs and CEOs and leaders. I would not describe my father's professional career that way. He was very totally ordinary. I don't think he was professionally notable, and he had kind of a mid-level bureaucratic job, and he worked for the same employer for over 30 years. And so, not someone who's famous, and not someone who has ever been invited to a conference to speak about his business experience, but instead, a very ordinary business person. And so I wanted to tell you a little story. When I was younger, and when my father was getting ready to retire at the end of his 30-plus years working for this organization, he did something that I thought was curious. He made a payment. He wrote out a check to his employer. Not for a large amount, but it was for, I don't know, $200 or $300 American dollars. And the reason he did that was to sort of compensate for pens or pads of paper or envelopes that might have come home from work over the years. Now, at the time, I was a teenager, and I thought that was almost kind of silly, like, wow, Dad, do you really have to do that? But later, as I've reflected on that little anecdote, it's become more and more profound the more I think about it. And it's dramatically influenced the way I think about values and the rest of our lives, our business lives, our professional lives, our financial lives, our religious lives, our family lives, and how those things are all connected. And so I want you to just think about that story as we sort of go back to this question of what is business ethics. I think it is about compliance and what's legal. I think it is about dramatic stories about CEOs and companies that do good things or do bad things. But it's also about something less than that, smaller than that, in a way. It's smaller and it's more personal. And there's an irony about that, because when we think of business ethics that way, when we think of it as being something small and personal and less, that's actually also the way in which it is about something more, because it's bigger. It's about who we are. And who we are shows up in these very small little decisions that we make every day. And so, that's the thing I want you to sort of consider as we think about business ethics. And I think it raises a good question that's even more fundamental. We could back up and say, well, okay, if we're trying to understand what business ethics is all about, what is business all about? What is the purpose of business? So this seems like an awfully fundamental question and a basic question to ask. When I ask that question to my students, what do you think they say? Make profit. I think that's often, I've got to go back here. I think that's often the case. I'm giving away some of my quotes here. Right. So we might say that business is about making money or enriching investors or maximizing profits, right? Oftentimes my students answer that question this way, but when I ask them that question and they answer that way, I always respond and say, that's the stupidest idea I've ever heard. And don't misunderstand, I think it's vitally important for a business to make money, but that's not the purpose. The purpose of a business, so these things might happen, hopefully a business is profitable and it makes money, but that's not its purpose. The purpose of a business, instead, is to create value. Whoop. So let's see, I'm going to figure out how to do this thing eventually. Here we go. There it is. Purpose of a business is to create value. And so I think that raises an additional question, which is, how do businesses create value? What is it that they really do? And I want to suggest that I think the purpose of a business really is to solve a problem. That every business that's profitable is solving some sort of problem. It's providing value that's valuable enough that people are willing to pay something for it, right? And so that might raise a more fundamental question of, in general, what would we describe as the problem that business is trying to solve? So here, let me go to a quote. Here's an old scholar said it this way, said that human society will never escape the problem of the equitable distribution of the physical and the cultural goods which provide for the preservation and fulfillment of human life. So you can see this quote suggests that, indeed, business is solving a problem. What's the problem that business is solving? Well, it's this one, and this is a scholar named Reinhold Niebuhr, and he said this back in 1932. So it was quite a while ago. But you can see that this is essentially what the problem is that business is trying to solve: the distribution of physical and cultural goods which make people's lives better. So the purpose of business is to make people's lives better, right? So, and I think we might say a business isn't worth much if it doesn't provide something valuable that helps us become more fulfilled, as Professor Niebuhr said all those years ago. So this is easy, I think, to understand. And you may be thinking, well, why are we taking the time to talk about this? Maybe all of us in the room sort of understand this. But I think it raises another question, which is, if this is so easy to understand, do businesses and do the people that run these businesses, do they always do a great job of doing this effectively and ethically all the time? Well, regrettably, the answer is no. They don't do that. Or we might say, we don't do that. As Elder Christofferson pointed out this morning, how did he put it? The line between doing what's right and doing what's wrong runs inside of every human heart. So this is us, right? So I think that there are some challenges, and that's what I want to kind of focus on for a few minutes. What are the challenges to doing business ethically? Because there's a lot going against ethics and integrity in business. Otherwise, it would be easy. Otherwise, it would always happen, right? So there are several things that pose a challenge, and let me just highlight those briefly. First of all, to a certain extent, we're simply fighting human nature. So here's Reinhold Niebuhr again. He says, "For all the centuries of experience, men have not yet learned how to live together without compounding their vices and covering each other with mud and with blood." So he's very eloquent in basically saying, we screw this up a lot, right? That human nature, left to our own devices, sometimes we do this wrong, right? Or here's the way another old philosopher put it. Benjamin, in 124 BC, said, "For the natural man is an enemy to God, and has been from the fall of Adam, and will be forever and ever, unless he putteth off the natural man and becometh as a child, submissive, meek, humble, patient, full of love." In other words, left to our own devices, we often choose badly. And sometimes our own nature gets the best of us. So, therefore, acting on our values must be deliberate. Autopilot won't get us there. We have to work at it. And the deliberate nature of choosing to walk ethically and morally and with our values is something that we accomplish one little decision at a time, which goes back to the story that I told you about my dad. So, think about that story that inspired me. When we're looking for inspiration, it may turn out that the small little examples are as inspiring as anything can be. And those choices, they might be small, but as I said before, ironically, that's what makes those choices big. So this idea that we have to sort of fight against our own natural tendency to be selfish, to be self-interested, to cut corners, these are temptations that we all have, and I think we have to work at that. So, as if that wasn't bad enough, this isn't our only challenge, right? There are several features of modern business life that also pose challenges and make this even more complicated. For example, another challenge we have involves incentives. So there's lots of money to be made. Incentives can incentivize all kinds of behavior. I did a big research study some years ago, and I looked at about 900 firms that are all listed on American stock exchanges, and I studied them for about a period of about 9.5 years. And what I found was, to summarize years of work in one sentence, what I found was that the more we incentivize top management teams, the more they get paid stock options and stock option grants, the more likely they are to cheat on their financial statements, So this is a published bit of research that I worked on some years ago, and essentially this is the finding, and you can just sort of see it visually. And what's interesting is the effect is sort of nonlinear. So the more heavily weighted towards incentive compensation the top management team is paid, the more likely, cooking the books becomes, right? So that's a challenge. Not only are we fighting our own human nature, but sometimes organizational structures are set up that actually kind of incentivize us to cheat. And so I think that's a challenge as well. Let's talk about one more, and that is the nature of competition itself. So it turns out, in the same bit of research that I was just referencing, I also found that the organizations that were most likely to falsify their financial statements are organizations that were sort of dramatically underperforming in their industry. So the organizations that were really losing, and they were losing to competitors, were most likely to falsify their financial statements as well, which I think we would say is unethical. I hope so. And so that's that's a challenge. Is that we don't like to lose, and so if we're losing, maybe perhaps out of desperation, we might resort to means that are unethical to try to achieve the ends that we're looking for. And so again, I just wanted to highlight, I do think there are challenges that we all face. Some of them involve just what it means to be human, and we can't always be our best selves, and sometimes if we aren't deliberate about being our best selves, that's when we get into trouble. In addition, there are some features of modern organizational life that pose additional challenges. Sometimes incentives push us towards unethical behavior. Sometimes the dynamics of competition make us reluctant to come out on the losing end in the competitive marketplace, and that essentially provides another incentive to do what's wrong. So this just means, all of this just means that it's often very difficult to conduct business the right way. It's a challenge. It's not easy. Sometimes it's really hard to do the right thing, and these challenges make it harder. But remember, I'm not suggesting that these challenges always corrupt us. Even in my data, going back to the charts I showed you, there are exceptions. There are organizations that paid lots of incentives to their executives, and those organizations didn't falsify their financials. There are exceptions to the rule. And I think that's what I think tees up sort of the final question I will ask, which is, what do we do about this? And how can we, instead of falling into these traps, how can we be an exception and be that example of ethical leadership, whether it's in our business life, our personal life, our religious life, our family life, our public life? So here's where I kind of want to bring us back around to where I started. That seeing business as small can help us see it as big. And it's recognizing that the little choices that we make are oftentimes the most important ones. They're the ones that most fundamentally get to the heart of who we are. And so I think that that's an important thing. This is something that Jacob Marley understood. So I'm going to, if you don't know who Jacob Marley was, I've got a book to recommend to you, which is a classic. It's a play, actually, by Charles Dickens. Jacob Marley was a fictional character. He was the ghost. He was the old business partner of Ebenezer Scrooge, and he visited Scrooge, and he appeared to him in chains, and he was in misery. And Scrooge says to Jacob, "Why are you so miserable? You were a good man of business." And this was Jacob's response. "Business," cried the ghost, wringing his hands again. "Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, benevolence were all my business. The dealings of my trade were but a drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business." And so he teaches us, I think, he realizes the thing that we all need to realize, is that our lives are made up of these little choices. And the business decisions we make are but, as he put it, a drop of water in the sea of choices we make across our lives. And so again, what I want to suggest and what I've wanted to argue in my remarks today is that one of the best things we can do is to connect our personal lives and values with our business lives, and that can be a key to understanding what it means to conduct our business with ethics and with integrity. Now, I also teach corporate strategy. In fact, I've written a book on corporate strategy. And so I have students every year that I have in class. I work with executives on strategic planning, and in the world of strategy, here I want to connect this back to the theme of the conference, how conducting business ethically is connected to our values. So, I might summarize business strategy the following way, that, it's a matter of connecting business opportunities in the marketplace with capabilities, with things our organization knows how to do well. And that's what creates a valuable competitive position. A good professor, I think, asks questions. And so these are the questions I would attach to these different lenses on business strategy. One question involves, what's the opportunity? What might we do? What could we do that might create value for customers, for people in the marketplace? And then there's this other question of, how do we do it? Opportunities and capabilities. But here's the thing. This is an incomplete way of talking about strategy unless we also talk about values. And unless we start with values, which asks a fundamentally different question. It's, why are we here? Why do we exist? What is it that's important to us? What do we value that we can bring to the marketplace? This involves mission and purpose and thinking about things like ethics and integrity. And without that overlay of values, just strategizing about opportunities and capabilities is just kind of tactical. It's empty. And you need to start with values in order to know what it is that you really should do to create value for those around you. So in summary, ethics is hard. I'm not here to tell you that it's easy. It's difficult. But organizations that are successful figure out how to make values a part of the conversation, and those choices around values are deliberate, and they start small. But they add up to something that points the way to what it means to be ethical in your conduct. Thanks.